Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about propaganda that's doing the rounds, suggesting it's more coming from like the Biden administration or the globalist, the globalist controlled media, that we're actually much, much better off than we were in the mid 1980s. This is pitching at the Western, particularly the white Western populations. You're way better off than you were. What's this talk about your standard of living is falling? What's this talk about cost of living crisis? You're way better off than you were. Well, you're just too fucking dumb to see it, you damn feral Nazi redneck. So this is the claim. So let's have a look at that. So depending on whose numbers you look at, we're between sort of 42 and 52% better off. This is an average in the West since 1985. Now, the claim is that this is adjusted for inflation, so it's like real cash in your pocket type better off. So let's have a look at that claim. Now, there are a few obvious things that are that are nonsense. Sure, wages have increased, but cost of living, particularly rent and that sort of stuff, housing, has increased at a much faster rate. So this idea that people are 50% better off is just simply absurd, to the point where it's insane fantasy lunacy land. But how did they come up with those numbers? Because they could kind of say, well, this is true, this is accurate. What's your problem? So there are a few things that they've done. First is they've looked at the top end of the projections of wage increases, and they've projected wage increases going 1 year in advance, but they haven't done the cost increases 1 year in advance. So they can add a few percentage points on top of wage increases there. And the other thing is how they calculate inflation. They use the spending pattern method of calculating inflation. So rather than looking at actual inflation, they say people change their spending habits. So actual inflation is not real inflation. And so they are able to reduce inflation by about 2/3 by using this method. So this is how they do it. They say, well, rents have gone up, for example, rents have gone up by 20% this year. But really, it's not 20%, because people will decide to go and rent a cheaper apartment or a cheaper dwelling. So really, the 20% doesn't affect anybody, because they all change their spending habits or spending patterns and go and rent a cheaper place. So really, there's no inflation at all in rents, because people have changed their spending and accommodation and choice of property type habits. Okay, all right. I mean, that's bullshit, but that's the line they play. The other thing, with food prices increasing, they can say that all food price increases are effectively neutral in the inflation, in terms of calculating inflation. Because I say the price of beef goes up by 10% on this month, they can argue, well, people will stop buying beef and they'll all go and buy chicken or lamb chops or something. So, but if in the following month the price of lamb chops goes up, then it's but then people will start buying beef and chicken, because beef didn't go up in 2 consecutive months. They can say, well, people stopped buying beef in month 1, but they did buy it in month 2. But as the price didn't go up in month 2, that's therefore neutral inflation, even though the price of beef went up 10% the month before that. So the price of all meat could go up by 20% for the year or more, but they can argue in this bullshit method they use, in consumption pattern spending, they can say that you would have bought something else, therefore in that month it wasn't inflationary. Even though the price of meat all went up in 20% across the board, they can argue for the whole year it was really zero inflation. Now, these are flaky bullshit numbers, and the methodology is deeply flawed and quite absurd. I mean, they're intending, if you're using that sort of mathematics, you're intending to deceive. You're intending to camouflage the actuality, which is, of course, is what is happening. They also use this as the third method, where they say, okay, well, rent went up by 10% this month, but the price of flat screen, for example, the price of flat screen televisions went down by 20%. So really, if you put the two together, inflation was zero because the flat screen television. Now, the idea that everyone who rents also buys a flat screen television then that month to create a zero inflation outcome is again quite absurd. But these are some of the tricks that they use, so they can they can come up at the end of the year when inflation could easily have been 20%. They'll come up and say it was really 1% or 2%. So they can argue, therefore, that your wages, your purchasing power has increased, not decreased, because wages went up by 4%, but inflation was only 2%. So you're 2% better off. So you then add those numbers up since 1985, the 35 or so years, 40 years, whatever since then. And you can say, okay, well, inflation only went up at 2% a year, and wages went up at 4% a year. And so therefore, you're 50% better off, according to their insane, fantasy land mathematics. Now, I've noticed this being talked about quite a lot, saying, well, look, all the wages went up and everybody's richer and everybody's better off. But in fact, it's the reality. I did crunch a few numbers on this. The reality is that on average, inflation's been running at between 8 and 9%, with wages increasing by about 3%. Now, the majority of that inflation was in the essentials of life. It doesn't matter if flat screen TVs go down in price. It's in the overall scheme. It's not relevant. You can't live in a flat screen TV. You can't eat it. You can't, ride it to work or something like that. So the cost of rent and transport, energy, housing, mortgage payments, all that sort of stuff is something you've got to have. You've got to have somewhere to live. You've got to eat and so on. So you've got to have energy. You need to drive your car. You still got to fill up at the station and so on. So all these costs are real and essential. It's only in the non-essential goods, the prices in an overall sense went down. But by including a basket of goods that is over heavy in non-essentials, they again can use that as a device to reduce inflation. So the reality is that inflation over that time was running at getting on for 3 times the rate of wages. So and this is particularly sort of the case not long before COVID. Places that you could rent for $500 a week and now $1,100 a week, this sort of thing. So, or mortgage payments the same. So this is really how they're doing it. But again, the intention is to deceive. The intention is to camouflage the actuality that the purchasing power of the paycheck today is getting on for 70% less than it was 50 years ago. And that really is being chewed up in rent. Here's an example I've used many times before. The first place I ever rented, and comparing the price I paid then to the price that same place rents today. And it used to have quite a spacious garage and a storage unit. That storage unit and the garage are gone now. It's just the apartment. So it's got a small storage unit now, but I was paying $18 a week when I rented it, and given the average wage, I'm using the average wage as the indicator here, but given the average wage at the time, that was about 20%, less than 20%, a little bit under 20% of your take-home net cash pay, after tax and after Social Security deduction. That was the tax that the net that you would take home. And so out of that, about a fifth went on rent. Now today, if that same place, but smaller in as much as it doesn't have a garage, that same place now, it's just over 50% of the average wage goes on rent. So if you look at that, that indicates or shows quite clearly that the cost of living has increased very substantially compared to wages. Now, if you look at the food bill, people's food bill, the proportion of each week what they spend on food, proportion of each week they have to spend on rent or mortgage payments, proportion they have to spend on energy and so on. It's all gone up out of sight, and electricity is just insane now compared to what it was. So these sort of things show that we're actually much worse off now. So why are they trying so hard with the propaganda to say that we're actually all better off? Because it's simply not true, not even slightly true. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.